Welcome to What the World Needs Now with hosts Tom Whisinnand and Josh Monroe.
In this episode, we talked to Jessica Lander, an EL history and civics teacher at Lowell High School in Lowell, Massachusetts, and author of Making Americans: Stories of Historic Struggles, New Ideas, and Inspiration in Immigrant Education, about how she connects the personal, present, and past of immigrant students to empower her current ones.
Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. For our listeners that don't have the privilege of knowing who you are you? What's your role in education, and where are you from?
Well, first off, thank you both for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with both of you this evening. I am a teacher in Massachusetts. So I teach all recent immigrant and refugee students at Lowell High School in Lowell, Massachusetts. I teach at the first integrated high school in the country, integrated in the early 1800s. And I teach history and civics to my recent immigrant and refugee students. My students come from 30 different countries, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Cambodia. And I have been a teacher for about a decade and started teaching at Lowell Public High School since starting in 2015. And then in addition to being a teacher, that is my first and foremost, my most important job. But in addition to that, I'm also a writer. And so I write op-eds on education policy and practice. And I just published my new book, Making Americans: Stories of Historic Struggle, New Ideas, and Inspiration in Immigrant Education.
That's awesome. I love the fact that yes, you're a teacher first and foremost, and there's no bones about it. But then like you found this other passion and you feed your passion for writing. And I think that educators that do that, who know what their passion is and then find time to feed that passion, are able to connect with students and the community at a whole different level than if you were a teacher and didn't have another like side passion.
Well, for me, they are like one and the same. Of course, teaching comes first, and my students are just amazingly inspiring, and I'd love to tell you more about them and the work they do. But the writing I do is essentially another part of my teaching, in that I am thinking about the policies and the practices that will better support my students. And so I see that as part of the work I'm doing outside of the classroom to support the work we do in the classroom with my students. So they're connected.
Yeah, it's nice when we find those passions that are able to mesh and help us grow in more than just one area. I'm interested to hear about your book because we got connected, the three of us, through Leah Jolke, and Tom and I had the privilege of talking with her. Tom's known her for a while, and we read her book. I can't wait to get my hands on yours. So can you give us a little sneak peek into it?
Absolutely. And Leah is just an amazing, amazing educator. And I have been so privileged to know her and to learn from her. Indeed, she is in the book. So I'll get to that and share a little bit about what I learned from her. But the book, I have a copy of it here. So it comes back to my students. The reason for writing this book was just how inspired I am by my young people that I get to work with every single day. And I'd love to tell you more of the work they're doing. But just even briefly, my students just do such powerful work in our classroom every single day, in stretching and growing and learning together and building friendships that cross continents, with my global classroom of students from 30 different countries. They are so just tremendously courageous in creating new homes here, in the determination and the grit and the perseverance they show every day. And then in the work they do in our community. So we just finished up writing a cookbook. We study immigration at the beginning of the school year, the history of immigration from 100 years ago. But of course, no study of immigration is complete without also studying the stories of my students, because of course they're experts. And so we conclude that project, that unit of study, with what we've now, it's come to be known, the Tasting History Project, where my students choose a favorite family recipe and they call up a mom, a grandfather, an uncle, often overseas, and they get that recipe and they translate it. And then they share a story about what that means and um, how that food connects to maybe a memory or a family member or a religious holiday. And then they share too about their migrations to the US and their journeys here. And we publish this cookbook and we share in the community. In
That's
a few
awesome.
weeks, we'll write op-eds and we'll the Lowell Sun, the local newspaper in our city, will publish a series of those op-eds. And in the spring, we will create we'll do action civics projects as a whole class and tackle community issues that my students care about. All of this is to say, my students are amazingly inspiring in both the work they do in the classroom, the work they do in the community. And that has got me thinking about how our schools can do better by our students, how our schools can better create welcoming, nurturing communities so that our young student or our young people, particularly our immigrant students, can thrive. And so I set out from the classroom for a year in 2019 to learn from others about how we together could reimagine immigrant education.
Mhm.
And I took a 1 year leave and then came back and continued to write and research while in the classroom full time. But I wanted to understand how we could reimagine education. And to do that, I thought we needed to look at three types of stories. First, we needed to learn from the past. We needed to learn from remarkable Supreme Court cases, landmark legislation, and movements that have transformed our schools. And I'll be the first to say I'm embarrassed that I didn't know these stories until I started researching this book. But they're stories that need to be known, and they are just remarkable stories. In addition to the past, we need to learn from the present. We need to be learning from schools and educators across the country who are doing innovative, creative work today. And so that's how I got connected with Leah and her classroom of thinking about those who are working with our immigrant origin students across the country, from Leah's classroom in North Dakota to an entire school district of 126 schools in Guilford, North Carolina. And then finally, we need to learn from the personal. And for me, this is the heart of the book, is we need to learn from young people. And so for the book, I profiled and I first sat down with 7 of my former just remarkable young people and my former students, and asked them if they would be my teacher, and learning from them about their journeys to the US and their experience of our schools. Because if we're thinking about reimagining immigrant education, we need to be learning and listening to young people. And so this book has those three types of stories: stories of the past, stories of the present, and stories of the personal.
I think that's incredible, and kudos to you for really empowering your students to be like super engaged members of the community that they're in. Like they have their newspaper articles that are coming out. I just think it's incredible that you are infusing their learning and putting them out there into the community as voices. That's awesome. Um, Tell me a little more about some of the journeys of your students, if you can, without giving away too much of the book. But I think it's important, like as an American educator, here's my pigeonhole, right? Like education looks like this. But a lot of times kids that are coming from overseas don't have those experiences. So what are some of those like?
Yeah. So, as I said, I talked to 7 remarkable young people for this book, and a few stories of them. There is Sreynith, who is the daughter of Cambodian genocide survivors, who came here as a young girl. So Lowell is um, has the second largest Cambodian population outside of Cambodia. And it's a wonderful, vibrant community. And Sreynith, uh, her story really for me speaks to just it's the creativity and the drive and the curiosity of my students. So she very early on wanted to be a programmer and a coder, and she couldn't yet take classes for coding, and so she taught herself coding. And I remember when she came in one day at lunch and showed me her first game. Um, and she's now in college for computer coding and computer science and entrepreneurship. But she talks about and shares her story of coming here, of the experience of her parents having been survivors of the Khmer Rouge, of wanting to get into those top classes, the honors classes, then the AP classes, then the dual enrollment classes, really from like day one of coming to the US, of thinking about college and thinking about pursuing higher education, which is true for so many of my students, of that drive for education. And that looks different for different students, of what type of education they're pursuing, but that drive for education. There is another student in here, Chori, who grew up in Baghdad and is just a remarkable young man who he talks about a conversation he overheard his mother having when he was very little that made him grow up, and the need for him to step up and really be, as he describes it, the man of the house. His father was not present, and he started working and started getting jobs, and small jobs, sweeping or delivering, from a really, really young age, to help his mom out, and every day handing her the money. And he he has just such tremendous courage and strength in having grown up in the midst of a war. He survived suicide bombings, and then came to the US and trying to find a home in the school. He carries a lot of tension, a lot of feeling on edge, as he would describe to me, and finding a home in our school's ROTC program, and finding spaces where he felt safe, and where he could step into leadership roles. There is my student, Diane, who her story starts off in a computer lab. And my students and it was the fall of their senior year, and they were all working on their college applications and the Common App. And she calls me over, Miss Lander, I can't answer this question. And the question asks on the Common App, what country are you a citizen of? I can't answer that question, because Diane is a citizen of nowhere. She was born stateless, and there is no option for listing yourself as a stateless person.
Huh. How does that happen? I'm really curious. Like, yeah, tell us more about that.
So if you are born into conflict, and so in the case of Diane's family, she was born, her parents are from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and she was born after they had fled, and they had arrived in Zambia as refugees. And so they're living in Zambia as refugees in a refugee camp. But many countries of first flight for refugees don't necessarily recognize those refugees as citizens, and thereby granting them the rights of citizens. But they've fled their home country. And so if you're born in those in-between spaces, you might not be recognized by any country or claimed by any country as a citizen. And so there are many stateless people. And so Diane grew up stateless. And so this question on the Common App does not even recognize the possibility of her existence, because you can only list countries, and there is no option that recognizes that she is stateless. And so that sets off talking about her story of growing up in Zambia, but not feeling that she belonged because no country recognized her. And then coming to the US, one of the parts of her story that she shares is receiving her green card. And that's the first time a country has ever recognized her, and how powerful that is.
Yeah.
And then there's a story of Robert. who is just an absolutely remarkable young man. And his story actually opens the book, is in the middle of the book, and closes the book. And Robert was born in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And when he was a young boy, about 11 or 12, he's not totally sure on his age, his parents were murdered, and he was orphaned, and he fled to Uganda. And in Uganda, at about the age of 12, he started his formal schooling. And so started in an academic classroom at the age of 12, and moved to a refugee camp in Uganda, and miraculously found extended family in the refugee camp. And then traveled to the US, landing in the US the day after the 2016 election.
Mm.
And he starts to create a new home here in the US. He is in high school. He enters as a sophomore in high school. I meet him for the first time when he's a junior, his first full year of school in the US. And by his senior year, 2.5 years after arriving, he is working full time, 40 hours a week, as a certified nursing aide, because he has to help support his family. His extended family, who he met in the refugee camp. And so he's working full time and also getting fantastic grades and trying to build community here. And he just so generously and courageously shared his story of growing up first in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then his experience of first living alone in Uganda, and then finding family in a refugee camp in Uganda, and then coming here. And he's just a remarkable young man. These are a few of the stories of the students in this book.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I know that for Tom and I, one of the things that we find most enjoyable for us doing this podcast is being inspired. So thank you for sharing those inspirational stories. I don't know, as I'm listening to you, I just find it hard to understand and comprehend the hardships that your kids are going through as a white male living in America. And I don't think that trauma has different levels. We all experience it in different ways, but it's hard for me to sit here and think about, like, how can you put school at the forefront of your life when you're dealing with the things that you're describing to us, you know?
Yeah, no, and it speaks to the strength of our students. And it's
Right.
also, I mean, education is so powerful and so important for my students. And it's something they speak about. And so it's thinking about how schools can be spaces that are welcoming and nurturing, and thinking about all those different elements that we could be thinking about, and the creative experiments out there that are doing really powerful, innovative work in thinking about nurturing that sense of belonging and supporting our students in all of their identities and all of their histories.
Yeah, Jessica, you talked about the importance of understanding history and some of the learnings, and sometimes they're not beautiful learnings. They're really kind of disgusting learnings that we need to have in order to move forward. And Josh and I are both in Nebraska, and so there was one story I think that you maybe want to share about Nebraska, and Josh and I would love to learn it. So if that's part of the history of learning, would you be willing to share that with us?
100%. So the book explores 8 stories of landmark Supreme Court cases, federal laws, and movements, and each is just so powerful. So let me tell you a little bit about Nebraska, and maybe I'll throw in 1 or 2 extras to get you excited about reading. But the Nebraskan story is really powerful. So in rural Nebraska, and I'm not sure where you guys are located, but we could figure out mileage wise how close to you.
Yeah.
In 1920, a May morning, Robert Meyer, who is a teacher in a rural parochial one-room schoolhouse, is teaching an 11-year-old boy the Bible in German during recess. And for doing this, he is arrested. Because at the time, in about half the states in the country, including in Nebraska, it was illegal to teach languages other than English.
Hmm.
And so Robert Meyer is arrested for teaching Raymond Parpart German, the Bible in German. Um, and he doesn't back down.
Mhm.
So he is fined, but he takes his case up through the courts.
Hmm.
And his case goes to the Supreme Court in 1923. And the Supreme Court comes back in favor of Robert Meyer. And it's a really fascinating, winding story of the precedent that leads the reasoning behind the decision. I'm happy to go into it. It's rather odd and fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
But okay, so there is a case from the early 1900s, end of 1800s, early 1900s, Lochner v. New York, which is this case. It was during the Progressive era, and it's widely considered just a terribly decided case. And then it's later overturned, where the court comes down. There are bread bakers in New York, and the court comes down saying, so the backstory is this is a time period where a lot of people are fighting for better workplace conditions and better pay and safer workplace conditions. And the court comes down on the side of the employer, saying, actually, it's really sort of the inside of the employee, but it's an odd twist of logic, saying essentially that to put in these laws to say have better working hours or better working conditions is infringing on the right of the employee to contract with an employer. That the employee has the right to be exploited, and that any laws that would prohibit this is infringing on that right of contract.
Okay.
It then makes it really hard to pass a whole bunch of legislation protecting workers for a long time. And it's finally decided that this is a terribly decided case and is overturned. But Lochner is the basis of the decision in Meyer, where it's just the court decides that Meyer has the right to teach, and this is infringing on his right to teach. But it also, this case, enshrines the right for young people to acquire knowledge and enshrines the right for students to learn languages other than English. And this comes out of Nebraska. It's one of the first cases that directly is addressing and thinking about the education of immigrant origin students coming out of Nebraska at the, what is it? The Zion Lutheran Church outside of Hampton.
Huh.
Yeah.
So what nationality was the student in this case? Was it German?
These were all the children or grandchildren of German immigrants.
Okay. So they were learning a language outside of English that may have been their grandparents or their parents' primary language.
Yeah, and this is the language that was used at church. This was the language that might have been used at home.
Sure.
And so they would speak and teach in English for much of the school day, but during recess, they were continuing to teach their students German, teach their students, pass on traditions and cultures,
Sure.
language. And this was illegal in 1920.
Huh.
And it's just it's a remarkable story of the courage and convictions of Robert Meyer,
Right.
and the impact it had on the nation. I got to talk to Raymond Parpart's daughter. So the 11-year-old boy's daughter is still living in the area. And I talked to the head of the church, the Zion Lutheran Church today, and he was just wonderful to talk to and so generous with his time. And he connected me with Raymond Parpart's daughter. And she told me this powerful story. It's in the book of how Robert Meyer, after the arrest and after the case, ends up leaving the Zion Lutheran Church, and he goes and teaches at another congregation, another part of Nebraska. But a number of years later, in the 1940s, actually, so 20 plus years later, he is called out of retirement for 1 year. and he is called out of retirement to fill a teaching position back at the Zion Lutheran Church outside of Hampton, where he was once arrested.
Mm,
And for that 1 year, he stays on Raymond's farm.
mm,
And his daughter told me about when Robert Meyer stayed on their farm. She was about the same age that her father was when Robert Meyer was arrested. And actually, for that year, she too was taught by Robert Meyer. But what is powerful and also deeply sad about this story is that she did not grow up learning German.
mm,
And not once during that year did Robert Meyer teach her German. And so we see these both powerful wins for a more inclusive education, a more nurturing education that celebrates and honors the identities of our students, and the power of Robert Meyer's courage and conviction of fighting this. And we also see the impact of laws that did try to ban language and did try to ban traditions and cultures and histories, and how that affected communities over time. So there's so much to this story, but right there in Nebraska.
right there.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good story of what a good teacher does, right? Like, you connect with your students, you bring education to them and help them learn and grow. And I think it's powerful as you tell that, like, that's what you're doing, right? It's what you're doing is not illegal, but it's super powerful and ultra important to help your students realize that they belong here, but they belong to a bigger part, and their past is them, right? We never want to take that away from our kids.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I talk about my own families. So my great grandfather, who I talk about in the book, arrived in the US as a 7-year-old, as a refugee from what is today Ukraine. And he arrived in 1906 into New York City at the height of the Americanization movement, which was trying to mold new immigrants into a very, very constrict image of what educators and policymakers thought it meant to be American, which at the time was as much as possible Anglo-Saxon. And at the time that my great grandfather arrived in the US as a 7-year-old, his language, his religion, his culture, his history was not welcome or wanted in schools. And so to think about the progressions and the progress that's made by the courage of people like Robert Meyer, by the courage of others. I'll tell you one other story just because it's really, really cool. There is the story, I don't know if you know this, of Mendez v. Westminster. So in the early 1940s, the Mendez family in Southern California go to enroll their 3 children in school. And they are told, no, you cannot enroll your children in school. You have to go to the segregated Mexican school, quote unquote Mexican school, because at the time in Southern California, or in California and in the Southwest, there were segregated white and quote unquote Mexican schools. And yet the Mendezes did not back down. And so they start organizing, and they gather families and they hire a civil rights lawyer and they sue the schools. And this case goes up through the courts to the Ninth Circuit. And when it reaches the Ninth Circuit, it is supported by a series of amicus briefs from organizations across the country, including one by the NAACP, written by Thurgood Marshall. And then after the case is decided, it's decided in favor of the Mendez family. It leads to the governor ending school segregation across California. And then 6 years later, the governor of California steps down as governor and assumes the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the very first cases he hears is Brown v. Board of Education. And of course, Thurgood Marshall is arguing that case. And then 2 of the other powerful woven stories into that is the reason the Mendezes are in Westminster is because they've just leased a farm, a really plentiful asparagus farm, which helps fund the case, funds hiring the civil rights lawyer and suing the schools. And the asparagus farm they have leased from the Munametsu family, who has recently been incarcerated during World War II. And the civil rights lawyer, just one more story, because there's so many stories in this one. It's just such powerful history. The civil rights lawyer they hire is the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. But what likely the court doesn't know is that he is married to a Mexican immigrant and he is raising his 3 daughters bilingual. And so that this case is deeply personal to him. And it's also personal for another reason, because as a kid, he played the violin. He loved music. His daughter told me this story, how at a recital, a music recital, when he was little, he was required to stand behind a curtain because he was Jewish and they did not want him to be seen. And another student stood in front of the curtain, miming the music. And there are just so many stories of people, courageous people interwoven in this one story that has had such a powerful impact on our schools. There's stories like this, stories of Robert Meyer that need to be known.
That's incredible. I love history, but when we can put the importance of history to people and the progress of society, it just magnifies that power, I think, infinitely. So we have these stories of the past, very powerful stories that shape the entire academic landscape of our country. How are we doing? Like presently, like F fail, right? A, we're making amazing progress. Like let's jump from history to like our story today that we were like you were talking about in the book. Where are we at, Jessica? How are we doing?
So there is remarkable innovation happening across the country. I think the thing that strikes me is that we need to connect that innovation and be able to learn from it. So a few inspiring stories of the present, because I think there's a lot to learn from and just a lot of creativity. We'll start with Leah. Her classroom in North Dakota, the work she is doing, which I know you've had her on the podcast, in creating opportunities for her students to share stories of self, to share stories of their migration, to be teachers in their community in Fargo. So for those who don't know Leah's work, and you should buy her book and read her students' stories. She has her students tell stories of their migration, and then they publish those stories and share them in the community. And they hold book readings, and they hold professional development for educators, and they hold talks at universities, and all the powerful ways that she is helping ensure that her students are teaching the community. And then also, I really was inspired by the work she does in building bridges and connections between old Dakotans and new Dakotans. So she has this class where she has students who are new to the country and students who have either been here for a number of years, or maybe their families have been here for generations. And they get to learn from each other. They teach each other stories and traditions, and they go out into the community and teach together to other students. They also share stories of self with a partner, and then their partner has to share that story with the group, but in the I voice. So taking on the stories of their partner, but as their own. And then she's just a wonderful teacher who is really that extended family for so many of her students, being there for all the big and small moments. So there are teachers like Leah who are just endlessly inspiring. And there are also school programs in other parts of the country that are doing powerful work. So there is the Global Village Project in Georgia, which is a school for refugee girls who have spent a long time out of school. Because if, say, you are a 16-year-old and you have never had the opportunity to go to formal schooling, you arrive in the US, you're put in 10th or 11th grade. Good luck. And so like that's really hard to succeed in school. If you've never had that chance at formal schooling, and then suddenly you're in 11th grade in a country that you are just now learning in a language that maybe you don't know. And so what Global Village Project does in Georgia is it recognizes this and has a school just for these students.
Mhm.
And it's a program where students might be learning kindergarten level material, but they can make their way up as they grow, as they learn to 8th grade. And they have a whole army of volunteers from the community, older men and women, who come in daily, weekly, working one-on-one with students to provide them those supports. And also beautifully, they are, because this is really essential, they're honoring that their students are also adults. They've lived as adults for many, many years. And so much of our kindergarten material is geared towards like little kids. But that would be really demeaning to be studying material that is geared towards little kids as a 16-year-old. And so they're able to balance those two identities and allow students the opportunity, the space, and the support to learn material at the levels that they might need, but in a way that honors that maturity. There is 5 schools in Colorado that um, do away with the idea that schools are open, say, from 7 a.m. to like 3 p.m. and then sit empty for much of the day, which is true in many schools. And so they have embraced a community school model where their schools are vibrant hubs of the community that are open from sunrise to sunset. And they partner with hospitals and nonprofits and businesses and groups of immigrant families, and they're all collaborating together and working together to support their students. And there is an entire district, I was mentioning this earlier, of 126 schools in Guilford, North Carolina, which at the heart sits historic Greensboro, where the EL district leader, this wonderful woman, Myra Hayes, just a wonderful educator, had for years been unsatisfied with the success of their EL students, their English learners. And they had tried lots of creative different approaches and projects and ways of teaching, and they saw success, but they weren't satisfied. And they learned of an idea to rethink literacy instruction. Often in teaching EL students and English learners, there is a tendency to think about simplified language first. And this approach said, no, from day one, we're going to be looking at complex language. But we're going to do it with all the supports that students can then manipulate and understand and explore complex language. And what Myra and her team did was help teachers across 126 schools working with English learners rethink instruction. And they did that through weekly PDs and monthly big PDs and one-on-one meetings. If a teacher was struggling, Myra or one of her team would go to the classroom that day or the next day and be like, can I model a lesson for you? Can I co-teach with you? If another teacher is struggling to find texts that are juicy and complex, can I go to the library and find you text? She was there, and her team was there for all the big and small moments, so that within 2 years, they're seeing dramatic results in their test scores in science and math and English and reading. And other teachers are going, what are you doing? We're seeing things happen in our classroom with our English learners. What are you doing? And can we learn from you? So there's just really exciting experiments and creative experiments out there. I think for me, it's how do we connect them? How do we learn from them? And how do we collaborate? Because there are still challenges that each school is grappling with. And so how do we grapple with those challenges together and then learn from the best practices each is bringing?
I think just listen, sorry, something's going on in my background. I think just listening to you is helpful for me, because our school just recently became an EL school. And so for the last 2 years, I've had my first 2 EL kids. And there's a lot of times I believe that I build that relationship with them and that we have that love for each other. But there are a lot of times that I sit there and I'm like, I don't feel like I'm helping this kid the way that I should be. And so hearing those stories, like now I've got places that I can reach out to, right? And connections through Leah, and I think that those are the stories that need to get out a lot more, because when Tom asked you the question, like, how are we doing in the present? Like, I don't know how, Tom, I took it as like a society, because I hear outside noise as we talk about it was illegal to teach German in many states. Like, I still hear that kind of outrage when, you get on Facebook or you listen to news that, how dare we do this? This isn't the American way, but really it is, right? Like, the American way, we're supposed to be a melting pot. We're supposed to be a country that embraces differences and loves people. And so I feel inspired hearing the stories that you're sharing. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is this tension between inclusion and exclusion that has existed in the country for generations, and it's um, can be really disheartening at times. And I think also these stories, particularly of the past, of thinking about when we hear xenophobic rhetoric. I mean, it's been said again and again and again, but then there are also these powerful moments of progress. And so how can we learn from those moments of progress? And how can we also recognize that we have this history of exclusion too? But I think to your point, I mean, so many of the people in this country trace their origins elsewhere. 98% of us trace our origins elsewhere, whether our families came by choice or by force. And so recognizing that we are a nation of people from elsewhere and making those connections. I mean, so actually fittingly, the story of Robert Meyer and Nebraska and the powerful work, it's just really fun to be talking to both of you in Nebraska with this story. Um, but so that story is paired with the story I write about Leah and her students, and thinking about the work that Leah and her students are doing now to build connections, to build bridges, to confront at sometimes xenophobia. There was state level policy that was proposed that her students went and testified against. To pair that with this story from Nebraska of 100 years ago, to see the similarities, the connections. I think all of these are about the power of connections and the empathy that you hopefully get from listening to stories. These are stories of people, whether they're 100 years ago or whether they're Leah's stories from the last couple of years. But those two stories are paired together very intentionally to think about how we can learn from our history and learn from our present, and of course also our students.
Jessica, this has been so much fun. I love learning about the past. I love learning about where we're at as a society today with embracing individual differences and really appreciating them from each other. Give us the name of the book one more time, if you would.
Absolutely. So the book is called Making Americans: Stories of Historic Struggle, New Ideas, and Inspiration in Immigrant Education.
Incredible. I think it's exactly what we need. At the end of this, Making Americans, every episode we end with one last question. Yeah. And it is, what does the world need now? So in your opinion, you're a teacher, you're an author, you're multi-award winning, you're really, really amazing at building community and serving those English learning students. What does the world need now?
Ooh, so many things. I think I will go with two. I think it's so important to be seeing each other's strengths. I think about my students, and we talked a little about it earlier. They bring such tremendous strengths to our classrooms, to our communities, from their cultural and linguistic navigators for their families. They bring incredible grit and determination of having lived in multiple countries and creating homes here. They bring a wealth of knowledge and experience of having lived in multiple countries, and just such drive and perseverance as they build their homes here. And I think it's so important, particularly in the work that I think about every day, of how schools see the strengths and invest in and value the many, many strengths of our students. And I think we could broaden that to how do we see the strengths of our neighbors, our community members, the folks that we work with, our colleagues, that we can then build better connections, stronger connections, learn and grow from each other if we're looking for those strengths in each other. And then I think too, and building off of that, because that comes next, is more collaboration. I think about my role as an educator, and so often uh, education is isolating. Too often, we don't get to learn from each other just because of how our schools are structured. And it was so exhilarating for me to be able to have this opportunity to learn from Leah and to learn from Robert Meyer's daughter, not Robert Meyer, Robert Meyer's students' daughters, Raymond Parpart's daughter, to learn from all of these people at the heart of history, to learn from these educators across the country, to learn from my students as they shared their stories, and to think about the ways that we could and are now starting to collaborate together to reimagine immigrant education, to think about how we can create stronger schools that really nurture for all of our students a strong sense of belonging. And to build that out for all of us is there's just tremendous opportunities because of the strengths each of us carries to collaborate more, to learn from each other more. And that's to both to share the ideas and best practices that we are doing in our work, and also to work together on the challenges that we're facing. And so I would say seeing each other's strengths, and then from that, really investing in and leaning into collaborations that we get to learn from each other.
I think that's a beautiful answer. And you are living proof of the amazing thing that happens when we are able to mesh those two together. Jessica, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It has been an absolute privilege and pleasure.
Thank you both so much. It is just a joy to talk to you and really fun. Again, with the Nebraska connection, I'm just really excited. But thank you for this opportunity. I love talking with teachers, with thinkers, with people who are trying to help create a positive change in our communities. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's our show. We're so thankful and appreciative that you took your time to listen.
Hopefully you're ready for another week of changing lives, and hopefully what the world needs now is helping you to sustain your inspiration as we journey through this school year together. If it is, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps us to get inspirational educators' stories out.
We hope that as you head out, you remember the biggest factor that plays into student success is you. Your love, your passion, your empathy, your dedication is exactly what the world needs now. Thank you for all you do. Have a good one.